The CompTIA A+ exams expect you to be able to do some pretty basic home router configuration. So I thought I would get a nice simple home router here and let's do some configuring. Anyway, if you take a look at this guide, this is a very simplistic home router. Now, the yellow cable is actually the WAN side of my router, and you can't see the LAN side of my router. The reason is because there's actually more than a router here. There's also a switch. So if you plug into any of these ports along here, you're plugging into the LAN side of the router. In fact, it's hard to read, it's impossible to read here, but it actually says WAN on that one particular port. Okay, now I don't have to be on the internet to configure a router. What I've done is I've set up my Windows 7 system for automatically acquire an IP address, and I know that this little guy right here will give me a DHCP address. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so I've plugged in. Now, this is actually interesting. Windows 7 recognizes that I've plugged into something new, and it's asking me if I want to do a home network, work network, or public. We cover this type of stuff in other episodes. So for right now, I'm just going to make it home. Now, the important thing here, I'm going to type ipconfig, and if I've done it right, there it is. I've actually seen that I'm now connected to that router. The reason I know I'm connected to the router is because I've set my Windows 7 system to obtain an IP address automatically, and it's got an IP address. And since the only thing I'm plugged into is the router, it's working. And the router by default is 192.168.1.1. That's a very common default IP address, and that's set up by the manufacturer so that it has a default IP address. Now, what I want to do now is actually get into the router and do some configuring. And all of these Soho routers just use a web interface. So I'm going to just open up my web browser, and I'm going to type in the default gateway. And that is going to be my router. Now, this router actually has some security, and it has a security certificate. Now I'm just going to go ahead and proceed anyway. And I'm actually now in the router. So all these routers are really use a web server as their primary configuration tool. Now they're all going to ask for a username and password, and they all have a default username and password. This one is admin because I actually took the time to read the little booklet that came with it, and that's how I know that. So I'm going to go ahead and connect, and ta-da, we are in the router. So we can actually do a lot of stuff in here, but for right now I just want to cover some of the basics. Invariably there's going to be some kind of initial setup, and if you take a look here, this is my initial setup. So right here is actually the IP address of the router on your network. Now I don't want to leave it as 1.1. I'm going to set my network up as a 15 network. And the reason I choose 15 is because it's not commonly used, and it makes it a little bit harder for bad guys to get into. So by setting my router's LAN IP address to 192.168.15.1, I'm in essence, and you can see here's my subnet mask 255.255.255.0, I'm setting up the broadcast domain for my entire network just by doing this right here at the router itself. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Now keep in mind I've changed the IP address, so I really can't get to the router. Don't let this fool you. It's not going to work, because what's happened is the router is no longer 192.168.1.1. It's now something different. So what I'm going to need to do is go back into my ipconfig. I'm going to do an ipconfig renew, and that basically is telling my computer to forget that 192.168.1 address and look for a 192.168.15 address. And it's going to give me some errors because I have so many different connections on here. But if we're patient, it will come up with a 192.168.15 address. Okay, so it took a minute and a couple of tries, but we finally got ipconfig renew to work, and you can now see that I have the 192.168.15 address. Now keep in mind, we only set up 192.168.15.1 as the router's IP address, so why am I now getting 192.168.15.100 addresses? And that's because these little Soho routers are very forgiving and will configure DHCP for you automatically. Let's take a look. So now I got to do 15.1 to get to it. All right, now we're back in the router, and what we can see now is if we take a look here on setup, you'll see we set it up as 192.168.15.1, and that's right, and that's what we want it to be. But these guys are very forgiving. So what they will do for you is they will automatically configure the DHCP server. By default, pretty much all of these routers have a built-in DHCP server so that all your computers can automatically connect. So if we take a look here, we'll see it says 192.168.15.100 to 192.168.15.149. We didn't put that in there. It did it for us automatically. It knows that if the router wants to be in the 192.168.15, that it's going to go ahead and pass out 192.168.15 addresses. So because I'm the only computer on here, I got the first DHCP lease at 100. If we plug in another computer, it'll be 101, 102, and so on. Okay, now that's just setting up our local area network. What we want to talk about now is how do we connect to our internet service provider. And that's usually going to be some kind of WAN connection is usually the term they use. And right now, if we take a look, this is actually a pretty cool router. It has more than one interface to connect on the WAN side. And if we take a look here, WAN 1 is actually where we would plug in our RJ45 from our cable modem or our DSL or whatever we have to be using. So I have to go into here and configure this. And it says obtain an IP address automatically, and that's pretty common. Most internet service providers want you to set the WAN side of your router to obtain an IP address automatically. So although I'm not plugged in right now, I will eventually get plugged in, and I will go ahead and it will automatically populate all this information for me. Now, one thing I do want to mention is most of these routers deal with DNS in a very interesting way. Keep in mind that you're obtaining an IP address automatically on the WAN side, so your router will get DNS information, which will populate this, which in turn will go ahead and actually populate it down into your network itself. If you want to, there's not much reason for it, but from time to time, you might find yourself in a position where you have to set up your own DNS, and there's usually a place to do that. And we saw that in that last screen where we could go ahead and manually type in DNS information. But on a lot of these, if you don't type anything in, it just automatically takes its DNS and passes it via DHCP to everybody who connects. Okay, so while we're in here, I want to take care of one really other big issue. And let's change that password. There it is. So this guy's going to make us keep the username of admin, but we always want to go ahead and put some new password in for that admin. We can also add a new username if we want and give it some new password. This is really important. There are entire websites that, based on the model number of the router, you can go in and access any of these routers using their defaults. So always change the defaults to prevent the bad guys from getting in when they don't need to. Now, the last thing that's always interesting to people is that if I'm only getting one IP address from my internet service provider. So when we set this up to obtain an IP address automatically, let's say if we wanted to set it up statically. If we type in an IP address here, I'm going to make something up that I guarantee doesn't work. And this would be the kind of IP address that we would get from our internet service provider. So if I only have one IP address coming into the router, how can we have so many other devices connecting to it? Well, the answer to that is because you're using something called NAT. NAT allows one IP address to be shared by a whole bunch of different devices. So what we have is on our LAN side, all of those 192.168.15s, those are all actually just using the one IP address that's coming from the router itself. All Soho routers are NAT by default, and we pretty much just enjoy the benefits of that, and it works. The two cool things about setting up a Soho router are that, first of all, NAT is running automatically. In fact, on these routers, it's actually hard to turn off. So you can always use private IP addresses on your own local area network. The second thing is DHCP. The DHCP servers work on these guys pretty much automatically as well. And as a result, one of the downsides to these routers is that if you plug it into your cable modem or whatever, and you plug your computers into the LAN site and just start it up, you're on the internet. And the downside to this is you have no security of any form, your default passwords are wide open, and it's an ugly thing. However, you do know now exactly where to go to make some of the basic changes for your IP settings.